The file had been sitting in a locked drawer in my grandfather's office for 11 years. Not hidden from us, exactly. Hidden for us. That was the distinction I kept turning over in the weeks after the accountant found it. The difference between a secret kept against you and a secret kept on your behalf by a man who had understood something about the people in his family long before the rest of us were willing to see it. My grandfather's name was Raymond Okafor. He built his business from a single panel van and 40 years of early mornings in Clarksburg, West Virginia. He died on a Tuesday in March, and by Friday of that same week, my brother had changed the locks on the warehouse. I will tell you what my brother said when the accountant presented the file. I'll get to that. But that wasn't the part that stopped me. The part that stopped me came 4 months before the accountant found anything. When I was standing in the building where I had worked alongside my grandfather for 7 years, and the new key code my brother had installed did not recognize my hand, none of them saw what that file contained. Some things are taken loudly, with speeches and arguments, and people choosing sides at dinner tables. Some things are taken quietly, on a Friday, while a family is still sitting with grief, and some things, it turns out, cannot be taken at all, because they were already placed somewhere safe by someone who knew. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet people carry impossible weight, and the reckoning comes on its own timeline. If you've ever watched someone take what wasn't theirs while everyone else was looking at the wrong thing, this one is for you. Stay with me. The file is coming. Subscribe and let's begin. My grandfather Raymond came to West Virginia from Nigeria in 1979, which was a harder thing to do than it sounds and a braver thing than he ever described it as. He came with an engineering degree from the University of Lagos, that American. Employers took years to fully credit and a specific quality of patience that I have been trying to understand and replicate my entire adult life. He worked in a manufacturing facility for 6 years, saved everything he could, and in 1985, he started a small HVAC contracting company with one van, one employee himself, and a business name he had been turning over in his mind for 3 years. He called it Okafor Climate Solutions, not Okafor Heating and Cooling, not Ray's HVAC, not any of the diminutive names that small businesses sometimes take on when they aren't quite sure of their own scale yet. Okafor Climate Solutions, a full name, a grown name. He told me once, when I was about 12 and asking him why, that he had always intended it to be a real company and he had wanted the name to know that from the beginning. He was methodical, my grandfather. He kept records the way other men kept faith completely, consistently, without being asked and without making it known. He had notebooks for everything. Client accounts, material costs, labor hours, equipment warranties, weather notes from job days. He kept the notebooks in a cabinet in his office at the warehouse, and when one filled up he started another and filed the previous one by year, and by the time I started working with him in my mid-20s there were 38 notebooks in that cabinet, a complete record of the company, from its first job in the summer of 1985 to the present. I loved those notebooks. I loved them the way you love something that reveals a person to you more completely than conversation does, the daily faithfulness of them, the evidence of a man who considered his work worth documenting. When I think about my grandfather in the years before his illness, what I return to most is not the big moments, but the ordinary Thursdays. Thursday was his end-of-week review day. He came in early, before any of the crew, and he sat at his desk with the week's notebook open and worked through the records, client calls, job completions, materials used, anything that had varied from the estimate and needed explanation. He never asked me to be there for these reviews, but I usually was, working on the operations, scheduling at the desk, across from his, because the rhythm of the office in those early hours before anyone else arrived was the best version of the place. Quiet, purposeful, full of the specific sound of my grandfather working, the turning of pages, the occasional scratch of his pen, the coffee percolating in the corner because he made it himself rather than waiting for the admin to arrive. I never told him that those Thursday mornings were important to me. I did not have the language for it when I was 25 and newly working there, and by the time I would have, we were in the years of the dementia, and the language of gratitude had to be compressed, simplified, offered in the moments when his mind was clear enough to receive it. I told him once, in a clear week when he was 81, that I was glad I had called him when I did, that the work had been the right work, that I understood things about what he had built that I couldn't have understood from the outside. He looked at me for a moment across the desk. He said, "You were always the one who was going to stay." I didn't know what to say to that. I said, "I didn't know that." He said, "I did." He went back to his notebook. I went back to the scheduling file. That was the last Thursday morning review before the illness moved into the phase that ended them. I have thought about what he said many times. You were always the one who was going to stay. Whether he meant it as the compliment I receive it as, or whether there was something else in it. The weight of someone who had seen clearly for a long time and had organized his arrangements accordingly. Perhaps both. He was a man capable of both. The early months at Okafor Climate Solutions, before I understood what the work really was, I had been impatient in the way of people who had been trained to move quickly. I had come from a world of college coursework and certification programs where the goal was to demonstrate competence rapidly and move to the next level. The business did not work that way. The business worked on the timescale of relationships, client relationships that had been building for 10 or 15 years, vendor relationships my grandfather had tended through decades of consistent behavior, the particular trust of a community toward a business that had been in their streets for a generation. I remember a moment in my second year when a large commercial client, a property management company that represented 6 buildings, offered us a contract that would have tripled our commercial revenue in a single year. It was the kind of contract that looks on paper like the obvious answer. My grandfather read the contract carefully. He asked 2 questions about the service specifications. He looked at the timeline requirements. Then he said, "No." I asked why. He said the volume the contract required would mean taking on technicians too quickly to train them properly, that the quality of the work on the other accounts would drop, that Okafor Climate Solutions had a reputation built on 30 years of work done to a standard, and that reputation was worth more than 1 year's revenue. He said, "If we do the work right for another 5 years, that client will come back and we will be ready for them." He was right. 5 years later, almost exactly the same company came back with a contract proposal. By then, we had 3 more senior technicians and a training program. We took the contract. My grandfather looked at me across his desk when we signed and said nothing. But there was something in his expression that I recognized as the look of a man who has waited long enough to be proven right and finds that he does not need to say so. I was still learning what that patience meant when he began to forget then. G.S. I have to tell you about my family before I tell you what happened, because the family is the frame around the picture. My mother, Adeze, was Raymond's daughter. She had his patience in concentrated form and his methodical quality, and something else that was specifically hers, a stillness in the presence of conflict that she had cultivated over 40 years of living near my father's family, who were not still people. She worked as a nurse for 26 years, and when she came home from shifts, she was the same person she was when she left, which I understand better now than I did as a child, is its own kind of extraordinary. My brother Marcus was 3 years older than me and had grown up with different information about himself than I had about me. This is the most accurate way I know to say it. He was the firstborn, the only son. And my grandfather had loved him in the particular way that immigrant men of his generation sometimes loved their first grandsons, with a weight of expectation that read, "To Marcus, as permission." He had worked at Okafor Climate Solutions in his 20s, doing sales and estimating, and had done it competently enough, but Marcus's relationship with the business had always been more about the business being his than about what building it required. I want to be fair to my brother. He had genuine ability. He was good with clients, easy in rooms, the kind of person who remembered names and asked questions that made people feel seen. If he had been a different person, in the ways that mattered, he would have been a very good partner. He was not a different person in the ways that mattered. I started at Okafor Climate Solutions when I was 24, after 3 years at a community college getting an HVAC certification and then an associate's degree in business administration. I had not planned to work for my grandfather. I had plans, vague ones, involving a larger city and a larger company, and the specific ambition of people who've been told their whole lives that they are capable of more than where they come from. My grandfather did not ask me to come. He mentioned once that the operations side of the company had gotten complex enough that he thought about having someone with him who understood both the technical work and the administrative side. He mentioned it once and never again, and I thought about it for 2 months and then called him. He was surprised when I called, not displeased. Surprised in the way he was, surprised by things that arrived before he had fully prepared for them. A brief pause, then the organized response. He said he would be glad to have me. I worked with my grandfather for 7 years. I want to be careful about how I describe those years because there is a risk, when you are telling a story about loss, of making the good part sound like a prologue. Like, it only existed to make the loss sharper. The 7 years were not a prologue, they were a real thing. I learned to run a business from a man who had built one from nothing, in a country that had not made it easy for him, by the specific force of his patience and his records. I learned that the work was not separate from the integrity, that you could be an honest business in an industry that rewarded the dishonest ones, and not only survive but be known for it. Clients who had used Okafor Climate Solutions for 15 years called when something was wrong at 11 at night because they knew someone would answer. That was not an accident. That was 30 years of my grandfather's decisions accumulated. Marcus was still at the company during those years. He was nominally the vice president of business development, which meant he brought in large contracts and managed the relationships with the commercial clients. He was good at that, but Marcus had a way of being good at visible things, while the invisible things drifted. He brought in the contract, and then the follow-through on the service agreement fell to somehow. Nails. He was present at the client dinner and absent from the installation meeting the next morning. He gave the impression of full engagement while operating at about 60% of what the work actually required. My grandfather knew this. He never said it to Marcus directly, at least not in my presence. He said it to me once, obliquely, in the way he said things that cost him, sideways, looking at something else. He said that Marcus reminded him of a house with beautiful fascia, which is the decorative trim on the exterior of a building. He said the fascia could be spectacular, and the structure could still need work. He said this and then he changed the subject and we did not discuss Marcus directly again until much later. I think about that conversation a great deal now. My grandfather began showing signs of the illness, vascular dementia, gradual at first and then faster when he was 78. He was 79 when we had the first serious conversation about what would happen to Okafor Climate Solutions. I was 31, Marcus was 34. My grandfather, being the man he was, had already had the conversation with his attorney a year before he had it with us. The conversation happened at the kitchen table in his house in Clarksburg on a Sunday afternoon in October. My mother was there, Marcus was there, I was there. My grandfather had made coffee in the specific way he made coffee, precisely measured, allowed to steep for exactly 4 minutes, the same process he had used since I was a child and which produced the best coffee I have ever tasted. He sat at the head of the table and he told us clearly what he had decided about the business. The language was not elaborate because he had never been an elaborate man. He said that the business was the work of his life and that he wanted it to continue after him. He said he had thought carefully about how to structure things so that it could. He said he had made provisions in his will and in a separate business succession document that his attorney had prepared. He said the business on his death would pass into a structured ownership arrangement, not a single heir, not a gift to be distributed or disputed, a structure. He looked at both of us. He said that Marcus would hold the majority operational stake, his title, his role, his place at the head of the business. He said that I would hold a significant equity stake and the role of operations director, which was the role I had been performing for 4 years. He said both arrangements were in writing. Marcus, at the table, looked like a man who had expected something and received slightly less of it, but who understood that expressing that would be inappropriate. I, at the table, thought that the arrangement made sense, that it reflected the reality of what Marcus and I each did and were capable of, that my grandfather had been fair and careful in the way he was always fair and careful. I thought that and I believed it. There was something my grandfather said at the end of that conversation that I did not understand at the time and have understood since. He said he had also made a few additional arrangements, the details of which his accountant, Gerald, would be in a position to explain at the appropriate time. He said this lightly, without emphasis, and then he asked my mother about something, and the conversation moved on. I filed it in the back of my mind. I did not take it out for 4 years. My grandfather died on a Tuesday in March, 4 years later. He was 83. He had had a good fall, better than the doctors had expected, a stretch of months where his mind was clear and he was himself in the specific full way that the dementia sometimes briefly allowed. He had sat on his porch every evening until it got too cold, and then he had sat inside by the window that looked out at the yard. He died in his own bedroom, which is what he had wanted, with my mother and me present. Marcus arrived at late. The hospital, we had moved him to the hospital in the last week, 40 minutes after my grandfather passed. He had been in Columbus on a sales trip. He arrived and he stood in the room for a while, and his grief was real. I want to say that clearly. His grief was real. On Friday of that same week, 3 days later, the locks on the warehouse were changed. I found out about the locks from Tommy Reyes, who had worked at Okafor Climate Solutions for 12 years and was the senior technician on the commercial accounts. Tommy called me on Friday afternoon and said he was standing outside the warehouse and the key code wasn't working and could I check what was going on? I told him I'd call him back. I called Marcus. Marcus answered on the third ring, in the voice he used when he was managing a situation. Even, prepared, forward-leaning, he said he'd had the security system updated, that he was tightening things up, making sure the transition was orderly, that there were some personnel decisions that needed to be made in the coming weeks, and it made sense to control access while that was being worked out. I said I wasn't aware of any personnel decisions. He said he'd been meaning to loop me in. I said that Tommy had been with the company for 12 years. Marcus said Tommy was fine. He wasn't going anywhere. This was just procedural. I said, Marcus, what's my new access code? There was a pause. The specific pause of a person who has been caught in an incomplete plan. Not a long pause, not a stammering one, but a beat too long to be natural. He said he'd send it to me. He sent it 4 days later. It was a temporary code that expired in 30 days. I did not point this out. I drove to the warehouse and I used the code and I walked through the building and I looked at what had changed. The notebooks were gone from the cabinet in my grandfather's office. Not moved, gone. The cabinet was there. The same cabinet, 38 years of annual notebooks. The cabinet was empty. I stood in my grandfather's office and I looked at the empty cabinet and I thought about what 38 notebooks represented, the daily, faithful record of a man's work, his decisions, his documentation of everything. And I understood, standing there, that Marcus had removed them because they contained something he did not want accessible. I did not know what it was yet, but I am my grandfather's granddaughter. I keep records too. I want to stop here for a moment, because some of you have been in a building that used to be yours and felt the wrongness of it, the specific quality of a place that has been changed in ways nobody told you about. If you've ever stood somewhere familiar and understood that someone had been working while you were looking elsewhere, leave one word below for me, just one, and subscribe, because what's in the file is coming and it changes everything. Back to it now. I am going to tell you what I did in the 4 months between finding the empty cabinet and the accountant opening the file, because those 4 months are the part of the story I am most proud of, and because they are the part that made everything else possible. I was not in a position to confront Marcus directly. Not yet. The will had not been fully probated. The succession documents were with the attorney. The formal transfer of ownership stakes was still in process. Marcus had taken operational control in the way that oldest male heirs sometimes do, through momentum, through assumption, through the specific authority of being the person in the room, making decisions while everyone else is still absorbing what has happened, and I was absorbing it. I am honest about that. My grandfather had died 9 days earlier. I was sleeping poorly and eating mechanically, and going through the motions of ordinary life with the specific performance that grief requires when you cannot stop performing it. The last thing I had energy for was a confrontation. So instead, I did what my grandfather had taught me. I started a notebook. I bought a new one, not like his. He used plain composition books. I bought a lined notebook with a dark green cover from the office supply store, and I began documenting everything I observed about the business in the weeks after his death, the changes Marcus made and when, the staff he spoke to and what he said, the client calls that came in and whether they were returned, the vendor accounts and whether the terms were being honored, the bank account statements I had legitimate access to through my operational role, which Marcus had not yet gotten around to removing. I also called my grandfather's attorney. The attorney was a woman named Patricia Oisey, who had handled my grandfather's affairs for 18 years. She was calm on the phone and careful in the way that attorneys are when they know more than they can say yet. She told me that the will was in probate and that the process would take several months. She told me that the succession document was real and legally structured and that my equity stake was protected by it. She told me that if Marcus was taking actions that appeared to contravene the succession document, I should keep documentation and let her know. I said I had started a notebook. She said that was exactly right. Then she said something I did not fully understand at the time. She said that my grandfather had also left some matters in the hands of his accountant, Gerald Winters, and that Gerald would be reaching out when the time was right. I said I remembered my grandfather mentioning Gerald at the kitchen table 4 years ago. Patricia said yes, she thought I probably would remember that. She said Gerald would be in touch. The weeks after I saw Gerald and before I spoke to Marcus were the strangest kind of waiting I have experienced. The waiting of a person who holds the resolution but cannot yet use it. I had the documentation, I had Gerald's folder, I had my green notebook, and I was still going to work every morning in a building where the access code was temporary, where my grandfather's notebooks were somewhere. I could not see them. And where Marcus was making decisions about the company our grandfather had built as though the company were simply his. I want to tell you about the business in those months because it matters to the story even though it seems separate from it. Marcus had moved quickly in the first month to establish the appearance of transformation. New signage, updated company vehicles, a website redesign that removed the history section, the paragraph about my grandfather, founding Okafor Climate Solutions in 985, with a single panel van. That paragraph disappeared without announcement sometime in early May, and I only noticed it because I happened to visit the website looking for a client phone number and found that the history page had been replaced with a page about core values. That sounded like it had been generated by a committee that had never met my grandfather. I wrote this down in my notebook: the date, the specific change, the fact that the founding narrative, the actual story of what this company was, had been quietly removed by a man who had been present for none of it. Tommy Reyes noticed it too. He mentioned it to me in the parking lot one morning, in the careful way he mentioned things he was worried about, which was to state the fact, and then wait to see if I acknowledged it. He said the website had changed. I said I had seen it. He looked at me for a moment and then he said, "Your grandfather always said this company's reputation was its history." I said, "He did say that." Tommy went inside. I stood in the parking lot for a few minutes, looking at the warehouse, at the building that had been the center of my grandfather's work for 4 decades, at the sign on the front that still said Okafor Climate Solutions, in the dark blue letters my grandfather had chosen in 1991 and never changed because he saw no reason to cheat. And something that was already right. Then I went inside and I did my work and I kept my notebook and I waited for Gerald's call. There were 3 clients who called me directly during those months. Clients who had my personal number from years of working with them. They were worried, not about specific things they could name, but about the general quality of the worry that comes when a business you've trusted for 20 years starts to feel different in small ways. One client, a building manager named Sam Chen, who had contracted with Okafor Climate Solutions for 11 years and who had called my grandfather Raymond, rather than Mr. Okafor because my grandfather had asked him to, called me in June and said he was trying to understand whether the service agreement terms had changed. I pulled up the records and found that Marcus had modified Sam's contract terms. Not dramatically, but enough that Sam had noticed. And Sam was the kind of client who noticed. I handled it. I called Sam and I told him there had been an administrative oversight and that his original terms stood. And I documented the conversation and the correction in my notebook, and I sent a follow-up email to Sam that created a paper record of the correction. Marcus had not been aware that I was correcting this behind him. He found out a week later when Sam mentioned it in a call, and Marcus called me that evening. He was not warm. He said I was going around him. I said I was managing a client relationship that had been part of my operational responsibility for 6 years and that the modification of Sam's contract had not been communicated to me through any channel I was responsible for monitoring. I said this evenly, without accusation, and I wrote the conversation down afterward, word for word. I was not angry, exactly. I was building. That is the only way I know to describe the feeling of those months. Not the heat of anger, but the particular accumulation of patience that comes from knowing you have what you need and the time is not yet. Right. My grandfather had kept a hidden accounting for 11 years. I could keep a green notebook for 4 months. The day before Gerald called, I drove to the cemetery. My grandfather is buried in a small cemetery outside Clarksburg, under an oak tree that was already old when he was young. I sat by the headstone for a while. I did not say anything in particular. I thought about the October kitchen table, and the coffee measured precisely and steeping for exactly 4 minutes. I thought about the notebooks, all 38 of them, and the fact that somewhere in those notebooks was the record of the first job my grandfather ever ran in this country. What equipment he used, what it cost, what the client paid, what the weather was, all of it written down because he believed things were worth recording. I thought about the phrase he had used at the kitchen table 4 years before his death, additional arrangements that Gerald would explain at the appropriate time. I thought about the fact that I had filed it and forgotten it, and that my grandfather had known I would file it and known when it would come back to me. He had been a patient man. He had been patient in the specific way of people who understand that the right moment is not the first moment, that preparation done in silence is not the same as doing nothing. I thought, I am not as patient as he was, but I am working on it. I drove home. I went to bed early because Gerald was calling in the morning and I wanted to be rested. I was not rested. I lay awake for 2 hours thinking about what was in the folder I had not yet seen. But I was horizontal, which in the months since my grandfather died had been the closest I got. Gerald called at 9 o'clock. His voice on the phone was the voice of a man who has been carrying something on behalf of someone else and is now, at last, able to set it down in the right pair of hands. He said now is the appropriate time. The Mont. HS that followed were the particular difficulty of watching someone dismantle something carefully, built by someone who could no longer defend it. Marcus moved quickly, in the early weeks, new vendor contracts, without consultation, shifted payment terms on 2 commercial accounts, a decision to drop the residential service line that had been a steady revenue source for 20 years. Each decision came to me as a fait accompli, a thing announced rather than discussed, from a man who had understood correctly that he had majority operational control and incorrectly that this meant he had sole authority. Tommy Reyes called me 3 times in those months. Not to complain, Tommy was not a complaining man. To ask questions in the careful way of someone who has worked for a business long enough to know when the foundation is shifting, he asked whether the service line was really being discontinued. He asked whether the apprentice program was being cut. He asked once, in a voice that tried not to be worried, and did not quite succeed, whether the business was going to be all right. I said I was working on it. He said, Ms. Nadia, your grandfather built something real here. I said I knew. I said, I know, Tommy. I drove past the warehouse on Thursday evenings. The evenings my grandfather had always done his end-of-week review, sitting at his desk with the notebook open and the week's records in front of him. I didn't go in. I drove past. I looked at the lights in his office window, which were now often still on at 8 and 9 at night. Marcus working late, with an energy that had not been visible when my grandfather was alive, and I thought about the empty cabinet. One Thursday evening I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, and I wrote in my green notebook. I wrote about the notebooks in the cabinet and what they contained. I wrote about the specific knowledge that a 38-year record of a business held, the kind of information that was not in any formal filing, the history of certain client relationships, the reasoning behind pricing decisions that had compounded into the company's reputation, the record of every handshake agreement my grandfather had honored, because honor was how he kept accounts. I wrote that I believed Marcus had removed the notebooks because something in them was inconvenient to what Marcus was planning. I did not know yet what that was. 4 months after my grandfather died, on a Thursday morning in late July, Gerald Winters called. Gerald was 71 years old and had been my grandfather's accountant for 22 years. He had an office above a dry cleaning shop on Main Street and drove a truck that was older than some of his clients and made. It's clear when I met him that he had strong opinions about his coffee, black, no sugar, the cheap kind. He had a file cabinet in the corner of his office that was organized by client with colored tabs. And when I sat across from him, he pulled a manila folder from a drawer and set it on the desk between us with the particular care of someone setting down something that has been waiting a long time. He said my grandfather had given him instructions. He said Raymond had brought him this folder 11 years ago in a meeting they had privately, without the family's knowledge. He said Raymond had told him that the folder was to be opened and its contents presented. After his death, at the time Gerald judged to be appropriate, Raymond had also told him the specific phrase to use when he judged the time was right, which was, "Now is the appropriate time." Gerald looked at me across the folder. He said, "Now is the appropriate time." I looked at the folder on the desk. I said, "What's in it?" He said, "Your grandfather's original business succession plan." I said, "I thought the succession document was with Patricia." He said, "That is the revised version. This is the original, and there are some differences." The folder contained a handwritten document, N pages, dated 11 years before my grandfather's death. It was in his handwriting. The clear, precise handwriting I knew from the notebooks. The same hand that had documented 38 years of business decisions. It was signed on the last page and notarized. Gerald had held the notarized copy. Patricia had been aware of its existence. She and Gerald had worked in communication with each other on this, carefully and deliberately, for 4 years. The document was a detailed accounting of the business's equity and a specific inheritance plan. It named me, it named Marcus, and it named with specific allocations the reasons for the allocations. I am going to tell you what it said. My grandfather had, over the 11 years before his death, been quietly documenting something. The document Gerald held contained a parallel record, not the official books of Okafor Climate Solutions, but a private accounting of the things that the official books did not show. Specifically, the record of what Marcus had been doing with certain company accounts. Over a period of 6 years, Marcus had been redirecting small amounts from the company's commercial revenue, not through overt theft, but through a series of billing adjustments, expense reclassifications, and vendor agreement modifications that, individually, appeared unremarkable. The amounts were not enormous in any single year. Cumulatively, over 6 years, they added up to a figure that represented a meaningful fraction of the company's annual revenue. My grandfather had found it. He had found it quietly, methodically, in the same way he found everything, by reading the records carefully, by noticing when the notebook's numbers and the official book's numbers did not agree. By keeping his own parallel accounting that he shared with no one, he had verified it with Gerald. He had then spent 11 years deciding what to do with what he knew. He had not confronted Marcus. He had not cut Marcus out. He had made a decision that I have thought about many times since, and which I have come to believe was not weakness, but a very specific and considered form of love. He had revised the succession documents to protect my stake, to make my equity position unassailable regardless of what Marcus claimed or did after his death, while leaving the operational majority with Marcus. And he had left the private accounting with Gerald, to be opened, after his death, as a record of what had happened. He had left it for me, not to use against Marcus, to know, to have the documentation so that when Marcus moved, as my grandfather had clearly understood he would move, I would not be standing in an empty room with no record of what had been taken. I sat in Gerald's office above the dry cleaning shop and I read my grandfather's handwriting for 40 minutes. Gerald sat across from me and drank his black coffee and waited. When I looked up, he said he wanted you to have the full picture. I said he knew. Gerald said he had known for a long time. I said, "Why didn't he?" Gerald said he didn't want to end Marcus. He wanted to protect you. I sat with that for a long time. There is a kind of love that is not warm in the moment, that asks you to hold something difficult without resolving it, to live with the full knowledge of what a person is, without cutting them out of your life. Because cutting them out would cost something you are not willing to pay. My grandfather had loved Marcus enough not to destroy him. He had loved me enough to make certain I could not be destroyed either. Those two decisions required each other and they cost him, privately, for 11 years. I folded my hands on the desk. I looked at the window of Gerald's office, which looked out on Main Street, which was the street where Okafor Climate Solutions had once had its first storefront, before my grandfather moved to operations, to the warehouse. I said, "What do I do with this?" Gerald said, "That's your decision. The document belongs to you. Patricia has copies. The notarized original is here. What you do with it is yours to decide." I said, "If I present this to Marcus?" Gerald said, "He will have to respond to it." I said, "Is there a version of this where he doesn't have to be destroyed?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That depends entirely on Marcus." I drove home and I sat at my kitchen table and I opened my green notebook and I wrote for 2 hours. I wrote everything that was in the folder. I wrote what my grandfather had known and when. I wrote what the hidden accounting showed. And then I wrote, at the bottom of a page, a list of what I wanted, not what I was owed. What I wanted, what I believed my grandfather had actually intended for his business, for his family, and for the 37 years of work that Tommy Reyes had been quietly faithful to. I wanted the business to survive. I wanted Tommy and the other long-term employees to have the company they had built with my grandfather under them. I wanted my grandfather's name, Okafor Climate Solutions, to mean what it had meant for EAT Tour. Decades. I called Patricia that evening and I told her I had met with Gerald. She said she had been expecting my call. We talked for an hour. At the end of the conversation, she said she would draft the legal communication. I said I wanted to speak to Marcus first. She said I could do that. She said I should also understand that once the documentation was in his hands, Marcus's options would narrow considerably. I said I understood. I said I would speak to him tomorrow. Marcus came to my house the following evening. I had called him and asked him to come, which he did, with the slight wariness of a man who knows a conversation is coming but hasn't yet identified its shape. I made coffee. We sat at my kitchen table. I put Gerald's folder on the table between us, the same way Gerald had put it between him and me. Marcus looked at it. I said, "Grandpa kept records." He was quiet. I said, "He kept them for 11 years. I watched Marcus look at the folder. His face went through several things. Recognition first. The specific recognition of a person who has known something was somewhere and has been waiting to find out where. Then something that might have been relief, in the particular way that people feel relief when a thing they have been carrying in secret is finally no longer secret. Then something older and less nameable. He said he knew. I said yes. He said for how long? I said 11 years since you were 31. Marcus looked at the folder for a long time. He did not reach for it. He did not try to minimize it, or explain it, or produce an alternative accounting. He sat at my kitchen table and he looked at the documentation of a thing he had done, in the handwriting of the man who had loved him anyway for 11 years, without saying a word about it. I want to tell you about his face in that moment because it is the most complicated thing in this story. Marcus was not a villain in the movie sense. He was a man who had been given an amount of entitlement and had let it make decisions for him that he could not take back, and sitting across from the evidence of what those decisions had cost, not just the money, but the specific grief of understanding that his grandfather had known that Raymond had carried this for 11 years and had not said it aloud, had instead arranged quietly to protect me and to leave Marcus the business anyway, had loved him through and past the thing he'd done. Marcus was not calculating. He was just there at my kitchen table with the full weight of what he was. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "That depends on you." I said there were two versions of what happened next. The first version involved Patricia presenting the documentation to the court as part of the probate process, the full accounting, the 6 years of redirected revenue, these specific amounts, the names of the accounts, Arcus's personal liability for a significant sum of money, criminal exposure, potentially, that Patricia had already consulted a litigation attorney about. The second version required Marcus to do several things: to acknowledge, in writing, the accuracy of the hidden accounting, to agree to a structured repayment plan for the redirected funds returned to the business accounts over 5 years, to accept a revised operational role still with the company, still with his name on the work, because his grandfather had built that name into the work and Marcus had contributed to it genuinely in the ways he was capable of, but with a formal operations oversight structure that included me, and with Tommy Reyes as senior operations manager, a role Tommy had been doing without the title for 6 years. And the notebooks, I said the notebooks come back. Marcus was quiet for a long time. I said, "Grandpa didn't write that document to destroy you. He wrote it so I would have the record, so I wouldn't be standing in an empty building with no proof of what happened." Marcus said he never said anything to me. I said, "I know." Marcus said, "Why didn't he just—" I said, "Because you're his grandson, and he loved you." and he wanted you to have the chance to be a different person than you were being. Marcus sat with that for a long time. Long enough that the coffee got cold. Long enough that I thought he might stand up and leave. Which was his right, and which would have started the first version of events. He didn't stand up. He said, "I'll call Patricia." I said, "I know you will." I got up and I poured out the cold coffee and I made a fresh cup for both of us because we had things to talk about, and I was not my grandfather's granddaughter for nothing. The agreement was signed 6 weeks later. Marcus repaid the first installment to the business accounts before the ink was dry on the signature page, which I had not expected and which told me something about him that I am still evaluating. Tommy Reyes became Senior Operations Manager with the title and the pay that had been missing from both for 6 years. The repayment plan ran for 5 years. As agreed, every quarter, the installment arrived on time. I checked each one against the ledger and recorded it in the green notebook. Marcus knew I was recording it. I had told him I would be, and he never once asked me to stop or to look away. That, more than anything else in those 5 years, is how I understood that something in him had shifted. The man who had removed 38 notebooks from a cabinet was not the same man who quietly made quarterly payments without protest, without negotiation, without trying to find a version of the arrangement where he came out different than he'd agreed. He was becoming someone who had decided to be accountable, which is not the same as being innocent but is its own form of becoming. He received that news in my grandfather's office, which was my office now, by the succession document, though I had not changed a single thing in it. And he said, "Your grandfather always said it would happen, just not when." I said he knew a lot of things he didn't say. Tommy said he was that kind of man. I said yes. The notebooks came back. Marcus brought them himself. In 2 boxes on a Thursday afternoon. He carried them in and set them on the desk, and I thanked him, and he stood for a moment in the office where our grandfather had worked for 40 years, and then he left without saying anything else. I opened the cabinet. I put the notebooks back in the order they had come from, by year, from 1985 to the last one my grandfather had completed. The cabinet closed the same way it always had. I sat at the desk with my grandfather's last notebook in my hands. The last entry was from 10 days before he went into the hospital. It was written in the careful hand of a man whose mind was doing what it could, with what it still had. Slightly more effortful than his earlier writing, the letters a little larger, but the precision still there. It was an ordinary entry: client call, service completion, weather note, a reminder about a vendor invoice, the ordinary record of an ordinary day. He had not stopped recording, not until he could not. I held the notebook for a while. Then I put it back in the cabinet and I opened a new one. A composition book, the plain kind, like his. And I wrote the date at the top of the first page, and the first entry. Okafor Climate Solutions is in its 40th year. Tommy runs the technical operations with 3 apprentices. He is training with a rigor and patience that would have made my grandfather nod. Marcus handles commercial accounts from a clearly defined scope, and he handles them well. That capacity was always real. It just needed a structure around it that he couldn't provide for himself. The residential service line came back. The apprentice program came back. My grandfather's office has one new thing in it: a framed photograph I found among his papers. Taken in 1985. Outside the warehouse on the first day, Okafor Climate Solutions operated out of this building. Raymond Okafor, 41 years old, standing in front of a single-panel van. He is not smiling in the large public way of photographs. He is looking at the camera with the specific look of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and why. I had it framed and put it above the cabinet with the notebooks. I talk to it sometimes. Not the way you talk to someone you believe can hear you. The other way. The way you talk when you need the discipline of saying something aloud, to understand whether you mean it. I tell him about the business, about what Tommy is building with the apprentices, about the commercial account Marcus landed last spring, the largest in the company's history. I tell him the notebooks are still there. I think he would nod at that. Here is what I have learned about hidden things. Not the kind hidden against you, though those exist, and that is a different story. The kind hidden for you. The kind a careful person builds quietly, without announcing it. In the years when they understand something the rest of you don't yet see, who is going to need what and when and in what form. The kind of love that looks from the outside, like nothing is happening. My grandfather spent 11 years keeping a record that I never knew about, to protect something I didn't know needed protecting, from a person I didn't know was a risk. He did it with no expectation that I would find out while he was alive to hear me thank him. He did it because it was the right structure, and because he was the kind of man who built right structures, whether anyone was watching or not. I try to be that kind of person. I do not always succeed, but I keep the notebooks. That's my story. One file in a locked drawer, opened at the right time by the right person, one grandfather who kept records because that was how he loved, and one cabinet, full again, that the business has been keeping for 40 years. If you have ever been kept safe by something you didn't know was there, if you have ever discovered after the fact that someone was watching out for you before you knew you needed it, leave a word below. I'll know what it means. Subscribe and share if this one reached somewhere real. I'll see you in the next one.